Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. I've got another Lenovo Legion Go S review for you here today. And this one's a little bit different than the white color model that I reviewed a couple months ago. It has the Z1 Extreme chip inside of it. It's the same chip as the original Legion Go, and then it also is running SteamOS natively. And this was made in partnership with Valve. It's the second handheld after the Steam Deck to come with SteamOS on it. And before we even get started, I wanted to say that this is probably the easiest and hardest handheld PC review that I've ever done. My big takeaway from the previous Legion Go S is that it had really good bones, and that the controls and the ergonomics and the screen were all awesome, but the internals as well as the operating system experience left a lot to be desired. And the addition of a more powerful chipset and SteamOS completely transformed this device to making it something that I think is actually awesome. But I also mentioned this is one of the hardest reviews I've ever done because it kind of put me in a handheld PC existential crisis. And that's because in many ways this is the best handheld PC that you can get today. I find it to be better than the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally X in many ways. And so midway through this review, I found myself kind of thinking about what I was going to do in the future when it came to these handhelds. Was I going to sell a Steam Deck or my Ally X and just use this as my main PC? That's how good this thing is. But when all is said and done, there are a few elements to this handheld that prevent it from taking the absolute crown. We're going to go over all that stuff today, everything I love about it, and then a couple things that make it fall short. There's a lot to unpack here, so grab your favorite snack and drink, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first things first, this is a loaner unit from Lenovo. They sent it over a couple weeks ago, and I've been testing it thoroughly, but I will be sending it back to them tomorrow. And like with all my reviews, all opinions are my own. They're not seeing this video ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. Let's really quickly go over the specs here. If you are into these handheld PCs, there are going to be no surprises, but it's always good to start from scratch. The CPU is the AMD Ryzen Z1 Extreme. It's a couple years old. We've seen it in other handhelds like the original Legion Go as well as the ROG Ally handhelds. It's also got a lot of RAM, 32 gigabytes and a terabyte of internal storage plus a micro SD card slot if you want to expand that. We've seen the screen a couple times already. It's an LCD panel, 8 inches with a resolution of 1920 by 1200. It also has a refresh rate of 120 Hz and it is VRR capable. The battery on this is the same as the other Go S, so it's 55.5 watt hours and it weighs about the same as well, 730 grams. In terms of connectivity, we've got Wi-Fi 6E, Bluetooth 5.3, and the top does have 2 different USB 4 ports. What really sets this one apart, besides the increased RAM and the new chip, is that it has SteamOS as its native operating system. Now, when looking at the different Legion Go S models and their pricing, it can get confusing really quickly. Essentially, there are 2 different CPU models, as well as 2 different color models, which coincide with the operating system they're loaded with. On the low end tier, we have the Z2 Go chip. That's the one that I previously reviewed, and that one starts at $599 for the SteamOS model, which comes in a dark purple, or we have $729 for the Windows model. That's the one that I reviewed. What we're looking at today are the high-end models. These have the Z1 Extreme chip, and the one I'm looking at is $829 with SteamOS. There is also a Windows version with the Z1 Extreme as well, but it goes for $900. Now, obviously, the pricing on these is really high, and it actually increased since their first announcement, which I expect has to do probably with tariffs. Regardless, the model we're looking at today retails for $830, which is quite a bit, especially when compared to the actual Steam Deck. Valve has not increased their prices, so you can still get the base model for $400 or $550 for the base OLED model or $650 with a terabyte of storage. But of course, bear in mind that the chip on the Steam Deck is not as powerful as the Z1 Extreme and also has a lower resolution display. Now, in terms of specs, the better comparison will probably be the Asus ROG Ally X because these ones have the same Z1 Extreme chip, and we also have a 1 terabyte storage model, which goes for $899, so very similar to the Legion Go S. It is worth noting that these prices also went up about $100 over the past couple months as well. So long story short, these are expensive handhelds. In fact, they are huge money investments, $830 for the one that we're looking at today. It is still kind of in line with that Asus pricing, but man, these are really expensive toys. Now, the controls and ergonomics are exactly the same on this model as they were in the previous one that I reviewed a couple months ago. I'll leave that old review linked down below, but I also want to quickly go over some of the things that I found from that video. So number one, we have a traditional Xbox style layout where we have offset controls here, a D-pad down below, our face buttons, shoulders, and triggers. None of those are really surprising. I think these analog sticks are great. They are nice and smooth feeling, and they have a full size to them as well. So no complaints about these analog sticks. The D-pad is also really good. It's a shield style rubber membrane. So kind of reminds you of like an older like Sega Saturn or Genesis D-pad, but still works very well. It does a great job when it comes to diagonals and the fact that it passes the Contra test, but then also passes the Street Fighter test. And so again, I kind of went through this stuff really thoroughly in the previous video, but I just wanted to mention that, yeah, it's really good. Same thing with these face buttons. They're really good. They are rubber membrane, but have a good amount of travel to them and feel very tactile. The menu buttons are a little bit different. You can see that this one up top now has a Steam logo. If you click on it, it'll actually bring up the SteamOS menu. This button below is our select button. On the right side up top, we have our quick access menu or QAM button for SteamOS, and then we have our start button below it. And this is one of the criticisms I have about this layout is that I wish the select and start buttons were up top as opposed to down below, because there are many times when I accidentally press these ones when I'm thinking I'm pressing select or start. And even after reviewing that other model and a couple additional weeks of trying to train myself to think this way, it still isn't working out. I wish the buttons were a different layout. For both of my primary handheld PCs, the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally X, they have the start and select buttons up top. And so my muscle memory goes there as opposed to the menu buttons, which are below. And so that is one slight annoyance that I have, is that I think that the select and start buttons are better placed up top. Now also up front we have a small trackpad. This is only really going to come into play when you're in desktop mode. When you're in gaming mode, you can navigate through everything with just the controller. The trackpad itself works fine. It gives a little bit of a vibration as you use it. I found that it's best to use it with your thumb and then use the right trigger as your left click, and that has usually worked pretty well for me. I kind of think of it as an emergency trackpad, that you'll only use it when you absolutely need it. You definitely wouldn't want it for gaming. Up top, we've got our shoulder and trigger buttons, our exhaust vent, then two USB 4 ports. These are 40 gigabit per second. Then we have an LED charging indicator, our headphone jack, volume up and down, and then our power and sleep button. The shoulder and trigger buttons on these are pretty darn good. The shoulder buttons are easy to press down on, but a little bit loud, and the trigger buttons feel satisfying, but don't have a ton of throw to them. The triggers also have a nice trick to them that if you flip them up, they become hair triggers. So if you're playing something that you want a really fast input, you can just flip this manually. Like with the previous model, I wish that the travel distance here with the trigger was a little bit more, but overall I think they're good. On the back, we've got our fan intake as well as two programmable back buttons. You can set these up for whatever you would like within SteamOS. And then finally, on the bottom, we've got our microSD card slot. Now, one of the elements that sets the Legion Go S devices apart is the fact that they have really excellent ergonomics. This is one of the most comfortable handhelds I've ever used. This thing has curves everywhere. You can see it's got a nice fat grip to it, but then also a really nice indentation here. It's just super comfortable to hold. I also love that it's rounded out around here and then a little bit larger on the bottom part as well. It just fits in my hand so nicely. For most other handheld PCs, I need something like an additional grip or a case to make them feel more comfortable. But this one I have been playing just fine on its own with no complaints. And even though it is a large handheld, it's 730 grams, it's still really well distributed because it is a larger handheld, so it doesn't feel super heavy to me. And it's actually lighter than my current setup with my other handhelds. For example, here, it's lighter than my Steam Deck OLED when I have my kill switch case on it. Now, obviously, the Steam Deck itself is lighter than the Legion Go S, but the way I actually use it, this one is heavier. Same thing with my ROG Ally X, which is on its own lighter than the Legion Go S, but I have to add additional grips on it to make it more comfortable, which pushes the weight over 730 grams. So even though on paper the Legion Go S is heavier than the other two models, in actuality, in my own personal use case, this one is lighter because I feel like it doesn't need a grip or a case to be comfortable. And so this one is the lightest of the three. Let's quickly go over the screen, even though I did cover it in my other review. Some of the highlights are the fact that this is a nice big 8-inch display. It's also a 16:10 aspect ratio, which means that it's going to be a little bit taller as well. And because of that taller aspect ratio, this screen is actually 37% larger than the screen on the ROG Ally X. And I personally think that this size and resolution of 1200p is an excellent fit for handheld PCs today. The colors on this are pretty good. They're not great. They obviously don't compare to something like an OLED handheld, but still, I think they are pretty good for an LCD. I also like that the bezels on this are relatively small. It's a little bit thicker on the bottom, but the sides are nice and thin. And so I think over the past couple weeks, I've come to the realization that this is kind of a Goldilocks screen. It's not perfect, but it does so many things right, and it's just really good in many different areas. I think the overall size is optimal, and I think the 1200p resolution gives us a lot of other options to work with as well. The 16:10 aspect ratio also works great when playing 4:3 content like retro games. You have a little bit of black bars on the left and right, but not as bad as it would be with 16:9. And because it's a 120Hz panel, that means we can use options like black frame insertion or a CRT beam simulator shader to allow us to have really nice motion clarity as well. And so one of the things I've come to realize over the past couple weeks is that this one screen might be my favorite one in all handheld PCs, and I hope that I see it more often. It's not going to win any awards when it comes to maximum brightness or OLED saturation, but man, 1200p, 16:10, 8 inches, 120Hz, variable refresh rate, those are all specs that I can get behind. And so again, it's not the best screen in the world, but I think it hits all those wickets really nicely. Now, audio on this machine could be a little bit better. I found it to be relatively quiet and muffled. In my previous video, I used a Windows app called FX Sound, which enhanced the overall sound profile and kind of fixed everything, but unfortunately, we don't have those same options easily within SteamOS. I appreciate that they're front-firing, but compared to something like the Steam Deck or the ROG Ally or even the MSI Claw, this one is definitely in last place. Now, the thing that really separates this device from the others is the fact that it is running SteamOS natively. Like, you don't have to do anything special, you just turn the thing on and it's going to be essentially a Steam Deck. And if you're not familiar with the Steam Deck, you essentially just log into your Steam profile, go into your library, find all the games that are compatible with your device, and download and install them. There's even a tab here that says SteamOS compatible. On the Steam Deck it says great on deck, but here you can see that obviously they couldn't have used that wording. And so of the 520 games in my catalog, 443 of them are playable on this machine. Now, SteamOS, like on the Steam Deck, is a Linux-based operating system, and it does have some limitations when it comes to game compatibility. A lot of it today has to do with anti-cheat software, so games like Call of Duty and Destiny 2 and Fortnite unfortunately don't run natively on SteamOS. So if you are planning on getting one of these handheld PCs specifically to play a certain game, then it's definitely worth checking out whether or not it is SteamOS compatible. Now, the interface in SteamOS is super easy to use. Other than just browsing through your recent games and going into your library, you also have the ability here to go into your settings and make all the adjustments you need to. This is where you'll do things like turning on your Wi-Fi or, connecting to a Bluetooth controller and so on. Also earlier, I showed off the desktop mode. You can find that in the power settings and just go here to switch to desktop. In addition to the left side Steam menu, you also have what they call the QAM or quick access menu. And here you can make some quick adjustments like adjusting your brightness or your volume or maybe going into airplane mode. Also below that, we have the performance section. So here you can set up your performance overlay to see your stats as you're playing. And then also you can change out your performance profile. For the most part, I only make a couple adjustments. First will be the profile itself. So you can go to low power, balance, or performance mode. And the higher the mode, the better performance you're going to get, but it's also going to drain the battery faster. Also in this section is where you will adjust the frame limit. So anything from 30 to 120 Hertz. And you can also enable or disable VRR. In general, I keep this one on. That means that as the frame rates are going to fluctuate, it's still going to be a smooth experience. So definitely worth keeping on. And that essentially is how SteamOS works. You just jump into your game. It feels very console-like. One of the other great things about SteamOS, being that it is a Linux-based operating system, is that it's not tied down to Windows Sleep. This means that at any time you can just tap the power button, it'll put the device to sleep. You can do that in the middle of a game or just through the OS menu. It doesn't matter, and it's going to save on the battery life. In fact, this doesn't drain the battery that much at all. And then, of course, anytime you want to pop back into your game, you can just tap on it. It's going to go right back to whatever you were doing in the main menu or while you were playing a game and so on. And so that is one of the bigger draws of SteamOS, is the fact that we have that easy sleep function, and it works really well. Now, that being said, I did encounter some bugs with the SteamOS version here on the Lenovo Legion Go S. For example, with Ratchet & Clank Rift in Time, I could not get the controls to work. I do not know what was going on here. I feel like at some point over the past 2 weeks, I was controlling this game just fine, but over the course of the past few days, I have not been able to play this game. So there may be some sort of fix to it, but I did want to mention that, yeah, I've had some controller compatibility issues. Another good example is with Marvel's Spider-Man. Instead of showing the actual keys that I'm supposed to press in any of the labels, it's just showing a question mark, and this has been really confusing as well. As you can imagine, you'll get a pop-up, it'll say press this button to do this action, but the button itself will be a question mark, and I have no idea what to do at that point. And again, there may be a fix for this somewhere in this SteamOS menu, but I was not able to find it. And this is just one of the many other bugs that I found, just kind of teething pains that I've had with the SteamOS experience on the Legion Go S. Another issue I ran into is that even though there are RGB lights around the analog sticks, natively in SteamOS, they don't have that function set up, so I'm not able to adjust the colors within the actual operating system. Instead, I had to load a plugin system called Decky and then an app called HueSync. This allows me to make all the adjustments I would like. You can see I have a very light yellow right here. I think it looks really good. It complements to the dark purple of the machine. And I'll leave a Reddit post in my video description that will give you the instructions on how to set this up if you run into this problem, but I wish it just worked out of the box. But even with those few bugs that I ran into, this has been a much better user experience compared to using this with Windows. I literally can just navigate through everything with my controller, and it's a very intuitive experience. If you want to learn more about the SteamOS experience, I've got a video talking about Steam Deck 3 years later. I'll leave it linked down below as well. And in that one, I talk about some of the other things you can do within SteamOS, and you can do all of that on the Legion Go S as well, including things like, using other game stores like the Epic Game Store or GOG. All that is possible within SteamOS as well. But the other main benefit of having SteamOS on this machine is that it greatly improves performance, even compared to other devices that have this same chipset but run on Windows. Let's dive into the benchmarks. Now, in my previous video, I tested the Steam Deck as well as the original Legion Go, and then that old Legion Go S with that Z2 Go chipset. And for all those tests, in order to keep it very equal, I ran everything at an 800p resolution because that's the native resolution of the Steam Deck, and the other two devices can also match that. And so with my testing here today, I also used an 800p resolution, so that way it would be an apples to apples comparison with the other devices that I had tested previously. So here's a quick recap of those previous results. The Legion Go with the Z1 Extreme chipset, like what we're reviewing here today, did pull ahead both in benchmarks and then just average frame rate while in game. And so given that the Legion Go S that we're reviewing today has the same chip as the original Legion Go, you might think that the numbers would be pretty close. But it's actually a pretty big difference. The benchmark alone is about 14 frames per second better than the Z1 Extreme on the Legion Go, and then the gameplay performance is also about 10 frames per second better as well. And so this is what I mean when I say that SteamOS actually can give you better performance on the exact same chipset compared to Windows. Now it is a bit more complicated than that because the Legion Go S that we're reviewing today does have more RAM than the original Legion Go, but still, that is a big difference between the two. And that's not even mentioning the fact that it greatly outperforms the Legion Go S and the Steam Deck as well. Now when it comes to actual gameplay, I prefer to play at a 1200p resolution since that's the native resolution of this screen, and I think it looks a lot better. And so in practical use with Cyberpunk 2077, I did use a 1200p resolution, but the Steam Deck preset. I also played this game in performance mode, which is the same mode that I used in benchmarking with all the other devices, including this one, but then I also cap it at 40 frames per second. That gives me a really nice stable frame rate, and so that's what I've been using here, and you can see that battery-wise I get about an hour and a half of battery. Let's look at the other benchmark that I did previously. This is Rise of the Tomb Raider, again at an 800p resolution but with medium settings. And in this example, the Steam Deck actually pulled ahead when it came to benchmarks, but when it came to gameplay, the Legion Go with the Z1 Extreme chipset gave an average of 60 frames per second compared to the others, which dipped down to about 55. And again here, there's a huge improvement with the Legion Go S with the Z1 Extreme running SteamOS. In terms of benchmarks, we're right under 86 frames per second, and then the gameplay also averages about 85 frames per second. That is a lot higher than the other options. Now again, in practical usage, these are not the specs that I would use when actually playing the game. Instead, like with all the games I'm going to test throughout this video, I kept it at a 1200p resolution. If I've got that many pixels to work with, I would rather see all of them, and so that's what I have it here. I also reduced the performance mode down to balance mode, which is the middle tier, to give me a little bit better battery life. That does reduce the frame rate. It can average about maybe 62, 65 frames per second, but I get about 2 hours and 15 minutes of battery life. And so from a benchmarks perspective, yes, the Legion Go S is doing a really good job, even better than the original Legion Go running Windows. So now let's go through and talk about actual game performance and some of these settings and whatnot that you can expect from the Legion Go S running SteamOS. We're going to start with the really easy lightweight games and then work our way up from here. Like I mentioned previously, we're going to keep it at a 1200p resolution throughout this testing. For the lower end games, you can use what they call low power mode. That's going to be the lowest power setting, and it's going to give you a lot of battery life depending on the game. For example, here with Shovel Knight, I got nearly 6 hours of gameplay, and with Celeste, I got over 5. I'd say the best way to describe it is that for any of your really lightweight indie games, generally those that are 2D or maybe a lightweight 3D game, you can expect somewhere between 4 and 5 hours of battery life when playing these games. And again, this is at a 1200p resolution. Most of these games don't have any sort of graphics settings, so I just played all these at the default settings. When you start getting into the more intensive lightweight games, things like Hollow Knight, the battery life gets a little bit worse. So for example, here it's just under 4 hours, which I think is still a great amount of time, especially when playing this game at 60 frames per second at 1200p resolution. When you get to what I would consider more of the heavyweight, lightweight games, things like Hades or Ori and the Will of the Wisps, around here is where you're going to get about 3 hours of battery life. I still think that's pretty decent for an x86 handheld, and also, again, bear in mind that we're playing these at 1200p resolution. If you wanted to drop this down to 800p instead, I bet you would get battery life closer to 4 hours instead of 3. This low-powered mode is also going to work great for older games like Portal 2. Again, 1200p medium settings, but with low power mode, and I'm getting about 3 hours of battery life here as well, even though at one point this game was considered to be, top of the line. Now, for most of these games, I'm just playing them at 60 frames per second, but if you want, you can also play them at 120 if the game supports it. And if you are going to play a lightweight game, you can still actually get some pretty decent battery life. So for example, with this one, I got a little under 4 hours of battery life with 120 frames per second. Now, if we cap that to 60 frames per second instead of 120, it gives us an average about an additional 1 hour of gameplay time with these lightweight games. I saw the exact same thing happen with Horizon Chase Turbo. I got about 3.5 hours when playing it at 120 frames per second, but 4.5 hours when I capped it to 60 frames instead. So it's really going to depend on how much time you have to play and whether or not you want to have a really high refresh rate or you want to play this for a long time. And I think it's really circumstantial. For example, if you are just kind of going to be relaxing on the couch for a couple hours, then sure, make that frame rate go super high because you've got a couple hours to kill. But if you're going to go on an airplane and you've got, like a 4-hour flight ahead of you, then you might want to reduce the frame rate to give you longer battery life. By the way, when you're in the game, you can set up a per game profile, which will basically create settings specific to that game. So once you've kind of locked in the experience with this chipset and what you expect to play with it, you can just go back to that every time you start up the game. It's going to start automatically. So when you open up the side menu here in the performance section, there's an option that says use per game profile. You want to turn that on. From there, you can set up your performance profile. You can see I have it set to low power, and then you can also set up your frame limit. So I'm having it run at 120 frames per second, but then also with VRR. And so these are the settings that I have set up for Horizon Chase Turbo. And the next time that I exit out of this game and then start it up again, it's going to go back to all these settings that I indicated earlier. So this is a really great way to dial in your settings for each of your games. You just have to go through once, kind of figure out how you want to play that game, and then from then on, it's going to be a very plug-and-play experience. Now, once you start getting into the harder to play games, then playing them in low power mode may not be enough. For example, with Octopath Traveler 2, this one cannot hit 60 frames per second in low power mode. It kind of struggles. Now, this is a variable refresh rate screen, which means that even when it's bouncing back and forth between the frame rates, it still feels relatively smooth. And with some games, for example, role-playing games, this might be a perfect experience here, especially if you want to get about 3.5 hours of battery life. Now, if you want to prioritize a higher and more stable frame rate, then I would recommend going into the next power mode, which is called Balanced Mode. This essentially is your middle tier mode, and it'll usually give you between 2 and 2.5 hours of battery life. And so in Balanced Mode with Octopath Traveler 2, it will essentially lock it at 60 frames per second, but I will lose about an hour of battery life in that process. And this is the preset that I would recommend for a lot of those middleweight games, those that are not really considered to be lightweight games, but a little bit more demanding. And like I mentioned earlier, I would expect somewhere between 2 and 2.5 hours of gameplay depending on what you are playing. And to me, balance mode is kind of the jack of all trades mode because, it'll work well in many different scenarios. For example, something like BioShock Infinite, this game can run at 1200p medium settings balance mode and get well over 60 frames per second and still give me over 2 hours of battery life. On the other hand, I can play a game a lot more demanding, for example Horizon Zero Dawn at 1200p low settings, again with balance mode but with a 40 frames per second cap. And this will give me somewhere between 2 and 2.5 hours of battery life. So again, a lot of room to work with when it comes to playing older games or newer games. It really depends on what frame rate you can live with. Here's another good example with God of War, a very demanding game. So here I'm playing it at 1200p low settings, and I have turned on FSR at the quality preset. And here with balance mode, the most stable frame rate is going to be 30 frames per second with this game, again giving me between 2 and 2.5 hours of gameplay. Now 30 frames per second for a PC game is not really ideal, but I think it works pretty well with a handheld. You kind of have to make some concessions when it comes to, the quality of the graphics as well as the frame rates. And for me, this is a very cinematic experience. And so I don't mind playing the game like this. But of course, if the performance is not to your liking, you can always adjust the performance mode as well. So let's use Elden Ring as our next example. So this game I'm running at 1200p low settings in the balanced mode, and this is giving me an average about 35 frames per second. I still think it's definitely playable, and I'll get a little bit under 2 hours of gameplay in this mode. Now let's say you don't actually plan on playing for 2 hours. Maybe you've only got an hour to kill, and you really want to push the performance to see how well the game can play. At that point, you can kick it into performance mode, which is going to unlock a lot more power. It's going to run usually at about 45 total system wattage. And this is going to drain the battery a lot faster. You're going to get about an hour and 15 minutes of overall gameplay, but you will get higher frame rates. In this example with Elden Ring, instead of getting an average of about 35 frames per second, I got about 40. Now for me personally, I don't think it's worth draining the battery that quickly to get an additional 5 frames per second, but the power is there if you want it. And so the way I look at performance mode is if I've got about an hour to kill and I don't really care about battery life, this is what I will use just to get the best performance possible. One thing to keep in mind is that this is when the fan is going to kick in pretty loud. Now, I don't think that overall it sounds terribly bad. I talked about it a lot in my previous video. I kind of like it when machines sound like machines, and this one has a similar sound profile to the original Steam Deck. So in general, yes, when you throw a lot of power at it, it is going to get a little bit louder, but I don't find it to be terribly unpleasant. Okay, let's briefly talk about emulation. Now, this is essentially a Steam Deck, which means that all the emulation tools that you have within Steam Deck, like EmuDeck and RetroDeck, they're all going to be available for you as well. For this example, I used RetroDeck, but if you want to have a more robust emulation experience, then I would recommend EmuDeck. I've got videos for each of them on this channel. Now, RetroDeck is a self-contained emulation platform, so if you open it up, it runs with Emulation Station Desktop Edition. What this means is that you can go through, navigate your systems, choose your system, and then navigate through the games as well and launch them from here. So a very kind of simplified experience, and it's all self-contained in a single app. And so this is what I used when I tested out my emulation. I didn't try every single system under the sun, even though this chipset is capable of things like PS3 and Xbox 360. That has all been tested a lot with the Z1 Extreme chipset. And so instead, I really was just confirming that everything worked as intended here on this device. I'll leave a link to an emulation video I did last year with the ROG Ally X. Again, the same chipset as the Legion Go S to give you an idea of all the games that you can actually play on this device. That being said, let's quickly talk about my experience with emulation on the Legion Go S. Number one thing here to bear in mind is that 4x3 content like NES and Super Nintendo, I think they all look really good on this device because of that 16:10 aspect ratio. With a taller screen like this, old school systems just look really nice. We've also got a lot of power to work with when it comes to emulation, which means we can tack on additional features. For example, here I'm using a CRT beam simulator shader. When running this shader on a 120Hz screen, that means that motion clarity will be much better than without it. On top of that, I've also added a heavy-duty CRT shader to give it a more classic look and feel. Even with those hefty shaders added on top, we're still getting an average about 3.5 hours of battery life when playing these retro games. Another system that looks really good on this device is going to be Game Boy Advance because the 3:2 aspect ratio of that original system is very close to 16:10. So these games are really going to fill up the whole screen, and I think it's pretty awesome on an 8-inch display. And so those are my main takeaways when it comes to classic retro gaming, in that 4x3 systems actually look really good here. You don't need to use widescreen hacks or anything. I think it still looks really nice. And then also, because we have a 120 Hz screen, things like CRT beam simulator shaders are going to be really great when it comes to motion clarity. Now with 16:9 systems, things like PlayStation Portable, they still look really good. You're going to have black bars at the top and bottom, but I think it is totally workable. And of course, we've got enough power to be able to play this at a 1080p or 4x resolution, no problem, and still get over 3 hours of battery life. It's going to be a similar story with GameCube. You can play all these games at a 3x resolution, and again here, I prefer just to play these at a 4:3 aspect ratio just because they fill out the screen nicely. And so even though games like F-Zero GX can be played in widescreen mode, I preferred to play it in 4:3 because I thought it fit the device better. It's going to be a similar story with PlayStation 2. You can see here that I'm playing these games at a 3x resolution and still getting over 3 hours of battery life. And then finally, I did test out one hard to emulate game. This is Breath of the Wild on the Wii U. And the nice thing about this version of the game is that if you go into the graphics packs, you can actually set it to a 16:10 aspect ratio and a 1200p resolution, so it'll perfectly match the screen. Now it's going to be pretty demanding at that resolution, so what I like to do is set it to a 40 frames per second cap, and I usually will get about an hour and a half of battery life. And it is going to be pretty darn stable at 40 frames per second. I did get some shader compilation stutters because I'm very early in the game, but overall, this is a very playable experience. And like I mentioned before, the Z1 Extreme chip is capable of playing things like PS3 and Xbox 360 and Nintendo Switch. Not every single game, but many will play well. Hey, this is Next Day/Editing Russ. I just went over all my footage and I realized that I wanted to add an explicit battery life section. Now, I show off the battery life in all of my gameplay footage, but I wanted to kind of wrap it up before we finish the video. The first thing to bear in mind is the Legion Go S has a 55.5 watt-hour battery. That is going to be smaller than something like the ROG Ally X, which has an 80 watt-hour battery. So we have less battery to work with here compared to other models. And the 3 performance modes that we have will give us a pretty good indication of the expected battery life. When playing in low power mode, I would expect somewhere between 3 and 4 hours of gameplay, and maybe better with really lightweight games. Now I think that's pretty good efficiency for the Z1 Extreme running SteamOS, but the Steam Deck itself does do a little bit better. The OLED model has a 50 watt-hour battery, so smaller than the Legion Go S, but will usually give you better battery life with lightweight games. Now at the balanced mode, this is where you can expect somewhere between 2 and 2.5 hours of gameplay, and this is the standard mode that I use for most of my games. And then we have the performance mode, which I would expect to eat up a lot of battery. This is going to give you about an hour to an hour and a half of gameplay. Now when you put that all together, you still get some pretty decent battery life with the Z1 Extreme version of the Legion Go S because you can play most games in that balanced mode. The other version that I had reviewed a couple months ago, the one that had the Z2 Go chip in it, that one had to push the power just to get games to run, which would give you about an hour and a half of gameplay. And so we are looking at better battery life with this one Z1 Extreme version compared to the other model. In my review of the Z2 Go model, I actually complained that it felt like a 90-minute device because every single game that was not a super lightweight indie game required you to play in performance mode, which would give you about an hour and a half of battery life. And so that was just what you could expect from that handheld. And even though the battery is exactly the same size between these Legion Go models, the Z1 Extreme running SteamOS is a lot better of a solution just because it's a more powerful chipset, which means it can run your games at a lower power profile and still give you some pretty good performance. And so for the most part, I would say that yes, on this model we're reviewing today, I would expect 2 to 2.5 hours of gameplay for most games, and then for lightweight games you can expect even better. And when it comes to x86 handheld PCs, that's not a terrible amount of battery life, but I do wish the battery was a little bit bigger. I think that 60 watts, even 70 watts would have been a better fit. It would have made the device a little bit heavier, but that is something that I probably could have lived with. Okay, so putting things together here, I'm going to wrap up again and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the Legion Go S, but in the context of the Z1 Extreme chipset and SteamOS. And many of the things that I like about this device are the same things that I liked about the original white Windows model that I tested earlier this year. And the biggest takeaway here is that it has the same good bones that we experienced in the other Legion Go S. So it is super comfortable, it has excellent controls, and it has that Goldilocks screen. I think the size and the aspect ratio and the refresh rate are all a really good pairing. The big thing to add to this column is the fact that SteamOS is a really good experience on this handheld. It really brings everything together. It gives you performance better than you would expect with this chipset compared to the Windows experience. And I love the fact that I can easily set up per game profiles so that once I've got it dialed in for that specific game, it is very plug and play. And when you combine that with the sleep experience of this Linux-based OS, it all comes together really nicely. Now, of course, it's not perfect and there are some things I don't like about it. Number one is this price point. It's $830 for this particular model. I also think one of the pain points of this handheld is its battery life. It's only 55.5 watt hours, and it's a little bit less than I would like. When you compare the battery life of this handheld against the ROG Ally X with 80 watt hours, it's kind of a night and day difference. And if you are the type of person that wants to have long battery life, this is not the best option out there. I also think the audio could be better. It's not to the point where I think it's bad, but there are so many other handhelds, especially around this price point, that do it better. Another thing I noticed in my testing is that the Z1 Extreme chipset is starting to show its age. It's been a couple years now, and I'm kind of on the lookout for something a little bit better. Which actually leads to my last point, in the fact that there are more handhelds on the horizon. We've got the next Legion Go, which is going to have the Z2 Extreme chipset. Same thing with the ROG Xbox Ally X. So I really want to see what the Z2 Extreme performance is going to look like against the Z1 Extreme. And the fact that we have two other handhelds coming out before the end of this year, one of them coming from Lenovo as well, does make it a little bit harder to say that yes, this is the device you have to buy right now. Now, in the intro of this video, I mentioned that the Legion Go S kind of gave me an existential crisis when it came to handheld PCs because it is so good. Over the past couple weeks, I've been hemming and hawing about this because, this is a loaner unit from Lenovo, but man, I don't want to give it up. I've been thinking, maybe I can hold on to it for an extra week or two. They gave me a month to do this review. I only did it in 2 weeks, so maybe I could hold on to it for a couple more weeks. Either way, I am sending it off tomorrow, but it got me thinking. And I really started considering maybe selling off some other handhelds and then just going and buying one of these. Initially I thought I would just buy this model in particular, but then I thought, well, I could also buy the Windows version of the Z1 Extreme one, the white model that looks exactly like this, and then put SteamOS on it. So then I would have the white color, which I would prefer, but then also the chipset I would want, and then the operating system I would want as well. And then I started thinking, okay, well, what can I sell? Maybe I could sell my white Steam Deck OLED. It's limited edition, so maybe I can get my money back or something close to it. And then maybe I could sell like my ROG Ally or an MSI Claw or something. Either way, I thought that I could maybe get enough money to then go and buy the white model, which is $900. But as soon as I started thinking about that, I was like, $900 for one of these handhelds is just preposterous, especially when I have these other ones that work fine. Yes, I think that this one is probably a little bit more comfortable than the others, and I love the screen on this as well. But I'm not sure if it's worth all that hassle in $900 to improve that experience. So in the end, I'm not really sure what I'm going to do, whether or not I'm going to buy a Legion Go S, but the fact that it had me considering spending $900 on this handheld, I think says a lot. So the way I see it, if you're like me and you've already got a handheld PC, yes, the Legion Go S is really good in some ways, but I'm not sure if it's going to be worth that upgrade price, just because it's the same old chipset we've seen over the past couple of years. It also has a relatively small battery compared to the other ones. So my conclusion would be that if you already have a handheld PC, it's probably not worth it to do the upgrade, just because it is more of the same, just more refined. Not only that, a lot of these older handheld PCs have support by Bazzite, which is essentially SteamOS that you can put on these machines and kind of get rid of Windows altogether. So that's a project worth doing, and it's less than $830 that you would spend on this particular handheld. So yeah, long story short, if you've already got a handheld PC, it's probably not worth upgrading to the Legion Go S, even though it is really good. And for everybody else who's just now jumping into handheld PCs, you're not sure which one to get, I think the Legion Go S needs to be a part of that conversation. This thing is super comfortable, it's got really good controls, a nice heft to it, and an operating system that just works. And I think that all those combined together are definitely worth your consideration. So putting it all together, in late June of 2025, if I came into the studio tomorrow and all of my handheld PCs had disappeared, I would replace all of them with just one single handheld, and it would be the Legion Go S. I would probably buy the white Windows model, and then I would wipe it and then put SteamOS on it just because I prefer that colorway. But overall, yeah, I think this is the one to get. But at the same time, if I come into the studio tomorrow and all of my handheld PCs are there as expected, then I am not going to spend $830 or $900 to get the Legion Go S just because it is very similar to the other handhelds I already own. And to top it all off, this whole conversation might be completely different 6 months from now when we have the Legion Go 2 and the Xbox Ally X and whatever other handhelds come out before then. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Did watching this video give you a handheld PC existential crisis as well? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.